Reminiscing about old times is fun. It does a lot of things for us, a lot of benefits in many ways. But one of the ways that we remember things are through our senses. And they say that your sense of smell, the olfactory sense, is the most heightened sense that is connected with your memories. So the smells that you have bring a richer flood of memories than your other senses. And one of the smells that brings a lot of memories for me is that of the ocean. And I've had several trips to the ocean, and one of the main ones was every year during college, our baseball team would go take a trip to Daytona Beach, and we would play for a week or two there, and the smell of the ocean was there the entire time. So every time I get a smell of salt water, I remember that time. And we've taken other vacations to the ocean, to the Gulf, and just a flood of memories come forth when that smell hits my nose. But as I'm thinking about my memories and how they're connected to our senses, it makes me think about how our memories remind us of what's normal. In most cases, remind us of what's good. Sometimes our memories can be bad, but in general, a lot of our memories focus on what was good, what was positive, of how that was a beneficial experience. But not all of our experiences are good, and we recognize that. Or maybe they don't start out good, but we see how God used them in the long run. I think one of the people from the Bible that had several experiences that God eventually used for good was that of Daniel. See, his experiences weren't always easy. We recognize Daniel was in difficult spots. And in chapter 6, we find probably the most famous story of Daniel. We start in verse 1, we find that Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces, and he appointed a high officer to rule over each province. The king also chose Daniel and 2 others as administrators to supervise the high officers and protect the king's interests. Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. Daniel had set himself apart from others. Now the setting here is in Persia. And at this time, Persia is the leading world power. They had conquered the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and now Persia was ruling the world. There was no one greater than them, and it was just the dominant world power at the time. And Darius is the king, and he is remembered in world history. He's one of the kings highlighted by the Persian Empire as part of the height of their actual power. Now, Daniel had distinguished himself as a high-capacity leader. It's not as though he was just someone who was okay or someone that was good. He was a leader of leaders. He was the best of the best. And King Darius saw potential in him. Saw that Daniel had something that was worthwhile. And I find it interesting to see the similarities between Daniel and Joseph. Remember, Joseph from the Old Testament was sold by his brothers and eventually went to Egypt as a slave. And he rose up through the ranks, success after success, and then he had another bad thing happen to him that wasn't his fault, but then he eventually became second in command in all of Egypt. He was a foreigner who was second in command. That's exactly what happened to Daniel. See, in Daniel chapter 1, we find that he was selected as one of the potential up-and-coming young people. And so the king invested resources in training him and equipping him. And now we find that Daniel, who's a foreigner, is primed to be second in command of Persia, the dominant world power at the time. So we see these similarities between Daniel and Joseph. But in chapter 1, when Daniel was getting all this training and all these resources invested into him, he still stayed true to God, because he was given a daily allotment of food during his training. But Daniel realized that the food he was receiving didn't honor God. And so he went to his supervisor and said, hey, can I do this instead? And he proposed a diet of just fruit and vegetables. Now, that's not something that really excites me. I don't want to go through the Daniel fast. But the supervisor agreed after much prodding from Daniel. And after the time trial that they set, Daniel was healthier and stronger than all of his other contemporaries. So Daniel proved that staying true to God, even though it may be different than what society deems acceptable or good, is beneficial. So Daniel sacrificed some good tasting food for some fruits and vegetables so that he could honor God. And our taste buds speak to some of the memories we have. One of the prime memories I have when I think of food is that of my grandma's noodles. And it was famous between my cousins and me, and growing up, we'd always want grandma's noodles. And while it's been probably close to 10 years since I've had my grandma's noodles, I can still remember the taste, still remember how they felt. I still remember how good they were. And I think of my boys, and Hannah's a wonderful cook, and there's several things that I know later in life they're going to say, man, I remember Mom's pumpkin muffins. Or I remember Mom's dressing that she made for Thanksgiving, or the crescent rolls, and just the way that taste speaks to our memories, speaks to what good times we had. So Daniel sacrificed that taste so that he could honor God, but there were people that were conspiring against him. As we continue in Daniel chapter 6, verse 4, it says, then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling government affairs, but they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. He was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. So they concluded our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion. So the administrators and high officials went to King Darius and said, long live King Darius. We are all in agreement, we administrators, officials, high officers, advisors, and governors, that the king should make a law that will be strictly enforced. Give orders that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions. And now, your majesty, issue and sign this law so that it cannot be changed, an official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked. So King Darius signed the law. All this stems from the fact that the officials were jealous of Daniel. Daniel had done nothing wrong. He did nothing that would warrant this type of behavior, except he was just good. He was responsible. He was trustworthy. He wasn't corrupt. He always did things with the king's best interest in mind, which, if you remember, was what the officials were supposed to do. He did what he was supposed to do, and the other governmental officials were not happy about it. David led with integrity. He didn't have any major character flaws that would just make him worthy of charges. So they had to make something up. They had to go fishing. They sought to get rid of him. Even though he was good, even though he was doing things that would making the kingdom prosper, they wanted to get rid of him. And so the only place that they could find or think of that would trap Daniel, that would make him break the law or put him in bad graces with the king, was in his religion, in his faith. He was faithful. He was trustworthy. He always did things the right way. So the officials approach King Darius with false motives. Now again, remember, the officials were supposed to have the king's best interest in mind. And if they had the king's best interest in mind, they would not have wanted to sabotage Daniel. Daniel was a great leader. He was successful. He made the king prosperous, and the officials wanted to get rid of him. They saw him as a problem. Now they approached the king and they used flattery. They talk about how good the king is. They boast him up and try to really butter him up so that they can make him ready for what they're trying to do. And I love how manipulative they are in this. They come to King Darius and they say, we are all in agreement. That wasn't true. Daniel was not brought in on this conversation. Daniel, who the king was priming to be his second in command, had no say in this matter. But they came and they said, we all, and the proverbial all, or proverbial we. And it may have just been those few that were with them. They may have been saying basically everybody except Daniel. We don't really have much more context. But they seem to be a little misleading in how they approach the king by saying, we all. But sometimes I think we do that. We hide behind those types of phrases because we want to get ahead. We want our agenda to succeed. We want our purposes to be the ones that are decided. So their approaching of the king was in a way that said, hey, we've got this great idea. No one should pray to anyone except you. If anyone prays to anyone except you, then they should be thrown in the den of lions. A little barbaric for our standards today, or archaic, kind of weird for us to think about that being the punishment, but that was normal in their time, and that was something that would have been feared for someone to be thrown into the den of lions. You know, from Daniel's standpoint, we recognize that in order for Daniel to follow this law, he'd have to break both commandment 1 and 2, no other gods and no idols. It's very clear, very explicit within the commandments themselves that Daniel should not do this. That anyone who is following God would be sinning against God if they chose to follow this law. But the officials convinced Darius to sign this into law. They convinced him that this was a good idea. And why wouldn't it be? Have everybody pray to me? Everyone view me as some type of deity worth praying to? That sounds like a pretty good idea, a pretty prestigious position for the king to find himself in. That's a good way to have the people revere you and think that you are divinely appointed by making yourself divine. That seemed like a good idea. But one thing we find that Daniel will show us is that you can pay attention to God or you can pay attention to the world, but you can't do both. Too many times, I think we try to do both. We try to keep God in one hand and the world in the other hand, or our desires, our wants, our needs, or whatever, and we have this tension pulling us apart. We're trying to be faithful to God while we're trying to hold on to the world at the same time. You can pay attention to God, or you can pay attention to the world, but you can't do both. We've got to separate them and saying if we're going to pay attention to God, then we need to focus completely on Him. Otherwise, we will continually be pulled away from God by the world. So Daniel's in the middle of all of this. And you know what Daniel does? He continues life as normal. And as I was thinking about life as normal, I was walking outside the other day, and I noticed some crickets chirping. And I just kind of continued on as though nothing had happened. And then I heard some cicadas and then buzzing. And it was just one of those things. I just paused for a moment and recognized this is normal. That there's no specific memory associated with hearing those bugs make their sound. But as I just walk around, I hear them. And that's something that just comforts me. Now, I can't say the sound of crickets chirping is something I look forward to or something that really comforts me, but it's familiar, it's normal. And in some ways, there's comfort in the familiar. So if I would go somewhere else and hear different sounds, different bugs, different birds, different noises, then it would be strange, it would be different. But when I hear those cicadas, or I hear those crickets, I think of things that are normal, things that are the same. And Daniel, we find, continues in verse 8. It says, but when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went home and knelt down as usual in his upstairs room with its window open toward Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he'd always done, giving thanks to his God. Then the officials went together to Daniel's house and found him praying and asking for God's help. So they went straight to the king and reminded him about his law. Did you not sign a law that for the next 30 days any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions? Yes, the king replied. That decision stands. It is an official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked. Then they told the king, that man Daniel, one of the captives from Judah, is ignoring your law and you. He still prays to his God 3 times a day. Hearing this, the king was deeply troubled, and he tried to think of a way to save Daniel. He spent the rest of his day looking for a way to get Daniel out of this predicament. In the evening, the men went together to the king and said, Your Majesty, you know that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no law that the king signs can be changed. So at last the king gave orders for Daniel to be arrested and thrown into the den of lions. The king said to him, May your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed the stone with his own royal seal and the seals of his nobles, so that no one could rescue Daniel. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night fasting. He refused his usual entertainment and couldn't sleep all that night. So again, as I said, Daniel continued life as normal. He didn't change a thing. He heard the law, and I think that's important that the text tells us that he heard the law. It's not as though Daniel just kept going on with life ignorant to the law. He knew the law that the king had signed, and he still continued to be faithful to God. And this shows us you can pay attention to God or you can pay attention to the world, but you can't do both. He didn't change. And in our world today, particularly in the United States of America, we talk about our freedom, but too many times we worry about what the government does or doesn't do instead of keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus. We focus on the government. We focus on the rules and regulations that they do or do not allow, and we get constrained by that. And I'm not talking about anarchy or overthrowing the government. That's not my point. But Jesus did come to bring a revolution. That revolution was not anarchy. It was a change of heart, a change of mentality, a change of attitude, a change of direction for those who would be faithful to him. Something different. And Daniel was living in that reality well before Jesus had even come. He kept his focus on God regardless of what the government, regardless of what the world imposed on him. So the officials, and I almost get this mentality of they just are either skipping over to Daniel's house or they're sneaking around the corner trying to see if they can see in the window to what Daniel is doing. Well, they find Daniel. They see what he's going through. They see the fact that he is praying. They say, he's breaking the law. They've got him. They have firsthand account of Daniel breaking the law. And so what do? They go skip on off to King Darius. And before they tell King Darius what they witnessed, they remind him of the law that he signed. And they said, you signed this law that people can pray only to you for the next 30 days. Anybody who doesn't gets thrown into the den of lions. And says, yep, I signed that law. And they said, guess what? Daniel was praying to somebody else. They trapped the king. Now remember, they were supposed to have the king's best interest, but they didn't. They had their own best interest. They were trying to get Daniel out of the way because he was viewed as a problem for them. So the king, recognizing the predicament that he and Daniel were both in, was troubled. He was worried. He was bothered by this. And so he spent the rest of the day looking for loopholes, looking for ways that he could get around this so that Daniel, his best leader, wouldn't have to be killed. So we find that Darius has at least some type of humility of recognizing the political trap that the officials set. It wasn't good. They didn't have his best interest in mind, but the king had signed it into law. So he was conflicted, but he eventually upheld the law that he had signed. So Daniel was arrested, and Daniel was put into the den of lions, and it was sealed. But before it was sealed, before the king left him, he said, I sure hope your God saved you. I hope your God rescues you. And while this happened, all night, the king did something that was probably very unusual. He didn't have his normal entertainment. It was important for the king to have food and sustenance, but he had entertainment. He was the king of the most powerful nation in the world. Anything he wanted was at his disposal. So he had all this entertainment every night, all the time, didn't have to worry about a thing. It was all catered to him, but yet he refused his normal entertainment. He also fasted. He couldn't eat. He was so distressed that he just didn't eat anything all night. And as I get the vision of the king sitting there in his palace, and one of the colors that comes into my mind is that of purple, because purple, particularly in the ancient world, was that of royalty. And so that was a vision or a picture I get of him. But in high school and in college, my school mascot colors were both purple. And purple, I can't say is the most common of colors. It's a color, I haven't got a purple shirt on today, but purple, whenever I see that color, may not explicitly remind me of my college or my high school, but on some levels it does. It brings back memories to events, sporting events, and pep rallies, and music events, and just the general theme of those schools. And it brings good memories. So the color purple is a color I like because of the good memories that were associated with that. Now, to be honest, I don't really have any prejudice against any colors, but the color purple sticks out to me because of all the memories that were associated with that color as I grew up. Now, the king had fasted all night, refused entertainment. And so this text continues in Daniel chapter 6, verse 19. Very early the next morning, the king got up and hurried out to the lion's den. When he got there, he called out in anguish, Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God, whom you serve so faithfully, able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, Long live the king! My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths, so that they would not hurt me. For I have been found innocent in his sight, and I have not wronged you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and ordered that Daniel be lifted from the den. Not a scratch was found on him, for he had trusted his God. Then the king gave orders to arrest the men who had maliciously accused Daniel. He had them thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. The lions leaped on them and tore them apart before they even hit the floor of the den. Then King Darius sent his message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. Peace and prosperity to you. I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his rule will never end. He rescues and saves his people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of King Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. King Darius rushed to the den. He spent all night not eating, not sleeping. He was worried because he valued Daniel. Now, the king could have found someone to replace Daniel without much of a problem, but Daniel had distinguished himself as the best of the best. And part of why he distinguished himself as the best of the best is because he always had the king's best intentions in mind. He called out in anguish, Daniel, did your God save you? That's not how the king normally acted. The king in this time would have been in control, would have been calm, would have been the confident one in the room, but he was distressed. But Daniel was alive. And I almost get this vision of Daniel kind of just reclining there in the lion's den, chewing on a piece of straw, just passing the time. He affirmed that he was alive because God had sent an angel to shut the mouths of the lions. And the reason is because Daniel was found innocent. He had done nothing wrong. There was nothing that Daniel had did that would warrant his sentence. He never wronged the king. So Daniel stands in complete contrast to the other officials. Daniel always worked with the king's best interest in mind, while the officials worked for their own interest. It had nothing to do with the king's interest of praying to Darius. Daniel was going to faithfully serve Darius even without that law. But that law got in the way of Daniel's greater conviction, that is, of his God. So we see with Daniel, you can pay attention to God or you can pay attention to the world, but you can't do both. So Daniel was freed. When King Darius saw that he was unharmed, that he was alive, he freed them. And one of the important parts of this is that Daniel didn't have a single scratch on him. So it's not as though that Daniel was able to stick a weapon in there and kill all the lions, or that Daniel was able to somehow overpower the lions. He had no scratch. The lions were subdued without Daniel's power. Daniel's not the one that provided the miracle. He just had the faith for God to provide the miracle. Without faith, that miracle would not have happened. He didn't have to fight off the lions. He just had to believe that God could fight them off. And too many times, I think we want God to save us from the lions before we are put in the den. And that's where it comes to pass. We can pay attention to God or we can pay attention to the world, but we can't do both. If we want to have courageous faith like Daniel, then we've got to face the lion's den before we know if God is actually going to save us from it. That's what it means to pay attention to God as opposed to pay attention to the world. Pay attention to our safety, our security, our prosperity, or pay attention to the living God who can save us, who can redeem us, who can provide for every need we have. But the officials show us complete contrast to Daniel. In fact, they were arrested and that they were thrown into the lion's den themselves for malintent because they didn't have the king's best interest in mind and they were dangerous. If a king can't trust his advisors, that's a dangerous position to be in. Leaders must be able to trust other leaders under them in order for them to succeed, in order for them to thrive. But the officials were killed right away. The lions tore them apart immediately. And it shows that the lions were not just passive. It's not as though they just weren't hungry at the time. They were malicious meat-eaters, terrifying creatures. That when all these officials were thrown in there, they were torn apart, showing that God provided the miracle, that there was nothing, no fishy business that happened. It was clear-cut that God provided the miracle. Then at kind of the end of the service, we get this feel-good moment where King Darius affirms Daniel's God. Now it's important we recognize that Darius didn't necessarily repent himself. We don't know one way or another if Darius actually changed from this event, but he affirms Daniel's God and said he is the God worth serving. That's who he is. King Darius didn't necessarily change, but he does affirm God, does affirm Daniel's God. Because of this, Daniel prospered. And he shows us that you can pay attention to God or you can pay attention to the world, but you can't do both. The last sense I haven't talked about is that of touch, of how we feel things that are familiar. A prime example that I've thought of is that of our tools. That when I grab my hammer, I've used it enough that I just feel comfortable. Or I grab the miter saw and I push the button to start it and put it down. And I just am comfortable in that setting because I'm used to it. And I think that's what a lot of our memories are. At least the positive ones. They show us what we're comfortable with. They show us where things are good. You know, grandma's noodles. But even the sound of the crickets and cicadas, it's not a sound I necessarily like, but it reminds me of what's normal. And I think that's where we can be with God. So I think back growing up how I remember the color of the carpet in the church was red. I remember the feel of the altar where I accepted my call to be a pastor. I remember the sound of the organ. I remember the taste of the communion bread. I remember all these things. I remember the smell of the church. I remember the smell of my Bible that my parents gave me that was embedded with my name. And I remember all these things, and it shows me who God is. Now, there's nothing intrinsically special about the carpet at the church, but that memory produces, or that sense produces a memory that says, this is who God is, and this is where God has brought me. This is how God brought victory in this setting. And so we come to these familiar places. But I wonder, for you, would you say that your relationship with God is familiar? Is it something that just happened in the past, or is it something that you're getting more familiar with right now? You know, you see the color of the carpet, and it says, you know, Jesus is doing something. We see the spot where Jesus has done a work in me, and I'm reminded of what Jesus has saved me from. Or I smell the Bible, and I say, this is the living Word of God. Too many times we're paying attention to the world, and so God doesn't become normal in our lives. Daniel, regardless of what the government did, went about life as normal. The government made a law, but he continued to serve God faithfully. Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to be a faithful servant of Jesus? If you want to start right now, you can. So we got a link that we have that you can tell us that you know Jesus is doing something in your life. You can tell us how you want more information on what it means to be saved, or how to get more involved in the church. Let us know. I'm telling you what, if you're paying attention to the world, you're missing out. You can be like those officials who are trying to get ahead themselves, but they're just leading for destruction. Or you can be like Daniel, who keeps his eyes fixed on God. And because of that, he prospers. Now, Daniel specifically prospered from a worldly standpoint as well, but he was focused more on his spiritual health. And when we do that, we focus on God, and then God will take care of the rest. You can focus on God, or you can focus on the world, but you can't do both.